If you had the option to retire at 55 instead of 65, do you think you'd be better off? Most people assume retiring earlier means running out of money faster. But the families I've worked with who retired at 55 or 58, they almost always end up wealthier in their 80s than the ones who kept working until 65. Not poorer, but actually wealthier. And that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. In this video, I'm going to walk through how people actually make retiring at 55 work, how they create income in those early years without penalties, and why retiring earlier often leaves families with more money, not less, decades down the road. My name is Chris McClure. I've been a financial advisor for over 31 years. And what I just told you, I've actually watched play out across real families over the decades. These videos are meant for straight talk for high net worth families who want to make smart decisions with what they've built. See, David was a logistics manager. He was 51 years old. He had about $1.5 million saved, and he'd done everything right. He saved consistently. He invested wisely. He never panicked. And he walked in with 65 completely locked in his head. He was going to retire at 65. That was the plan. It seemed responsible, and it seemed like what you do when you're serious about retirement. So I'm a bit of a weirdo in this situation. I love to run the numbers, right? And what we found actually surprised him. He could retire at 59, not 65, but actually 59. And that was 6 years earlier than he had ever considered. Before I get to what that number actually meant to him, it's worth understanding where 65 came from in the first place. You see, 62 is the earliest you can claim Social Security, and 65 is actually when Medicare begins. And that's it. That's the only reason people think about 62 and 65. They're government program dates built around federal policy, not around your health, not around your energy, or it's a decade of your life when you're actually at your best. Somehow they became the default retirement age for just about everyone. And the question almost nobody actually asks is this: what retirement age actually fits you best? Which retirement age gives you the best life? If you saved well and you built real assets, the answer might be very different from what the calendar says, or from what Social Security says, or from what Medicare says. There's this researcher, his name is Michael Kitces, and he studied something most retirement planning ignores. And it wasn't actually how people save for retirement, but how they actually live in it. What he found is that retirement isn't one long, even stretch. It actually changes on you. The early years of retirement, he actually calls the go-go years. You've got high energy, you've got good knees, good lungs, good feet, and you've got enthusiasm. Maybe you're traveling, you're going to Italy, you're going to Iceland, you're taking a tour around America. Maybe you're hiking with the grandkids instead of watching from a lawn chair. Or maybe you take a trip that you've been planning for 15 years. Your body says yes to almost everything, and you're able to do things that you aren't in your 70s and 80s. And somewhere in your late 60s, maybe to early 70s, life starts to kind of slow down. Kitces calls these the slow go years. You still travel, you just travel differently. Going to France, now you're going to Napa. Instead of going to Switzerland, you're going to Colorado, right? Instead of taking a trip to South America, you're going to Arizona. And it just takes a longer time to recover, which is perfectly understandable for someone in their 70s. And then there are the no-go years. And this is where your world gets kind of smaller. You see, healthcare takes up more of the budget. The big bucket list things, that they've given way to more familiar things. If you retire at 55, you're probably looking at a full decade or more in the go-go years. You see, you've got 10 years of energy and the mobility and the body movement to actually do the things you saved all this money for. If you retire at 65 and those years are probably wrapping up somewhere in your early 70s, you've given yourself 5 or 6 years of good retirement energy. You've lost that decade before that for a paycheck you probably didn't need. I had a client tell me once, she was in her early 70s. She said, everyone told me the 60s are the new 50s, and they're right. But when you hit 70, you start to feel it, right? So you start to feel like you're 70. And she worked until 65, but she didn't have to. So that original story on David was 51. His go-go years were right in front of him, and he was about to accidentally work through most of them. He was going to work to 65. That was his plan. And when we discuss these ideas, the place to start, it isn't with the money, it's with your life. What does your retirement actually look like? Where do you want to live? What does a Tuesday feel like? Are you near your grandkids? Are you finally doing the thing you've been putting off for a decade? Once you know what you actually want, you can put real price tags on it. It's not guesses, it's actual costs. And for most people, that number ends up lower than they assume, especially once you back out of the cost of working. People forget how expensive a job is to have. The commuting, the clothes, the dry cleaning, the lunches, all the ways stress quietly drives spending. For high earners, that can be something like $2,000 to $4,000 a month that just disappears the day you stop. And what a lot of families find is that they're closer to early retirement than they ever thought. Not recklessly close, not like run out of money close, but actually close. And so just real quickly, if you're watching this and you're already wondering what your own numbers look like, there's a link below where you can chat with me. There's no pressure. It's just an honest conversation about your situation. I'd be happy to chat with you. So back to David. If you remember, he was going to retire at 65. We talked about retiring at 59. The concept worked, and the main question that he had is, how do I actually fund those years before Social Security and Medicare kick in without getting hit with penalties? The most straightforward answer for most people is a taxable brokerage account. There's no penalty, there's no age restrictions, capital gains treatment on all the growth, and you have full access to your money from day one. You can use it to fund your early years while your IRAs and your 401ks keep growing in the background. And also that separation, it creates room to do Roth conversions at lower tax rates, which matters more than most people realize. If most of your money is inside a 401k, there's actually a rule. It's something called the Rule of 55, and it's something that most people haven't heard of. If you leave your employer in the year you turn 55 or later, you can take withdrawals from your 401k without the 10% penalty. No 10% penalty. A lot of people think their money is locked up until 59 and a half, and that's simply not true. The next option is the 72T option. So there's this rule, it's an IRS rule called 72T. And what it does is it requires you to take out substantially equal periodic payments. And so it's really specialized and designed for people who retire in their 40s or early 50s with most of their wealth inside their retirement account. The rules are strict enough that I've seen some people get into real trouble trying to sort it out alone. So it's not really a do-it-yourself situation. You have to structure it correctly and make sure you're paying the right taxes and that you're taking it out correctly. But it can bridge that 5 to 10-year period without penalty. So let's get back to David. So what did this actually do for him? And what did it look like for David? Well, as I mentioned, he had about $1.5 million saved. Around $350,000 of it was in a brokerage account. And that was money he had been parking there for years after maxing out his 401k and still having money left. His 401k had around $1 million and a smaller Roth on top of that. The plan for the years between 59 and 65 before Medicare and before Social Security, he used the brokerage account as the workhorse. He and his wife figured they needed about $7,500 a month, and his wife was going to keep working part-time, bringing in a couple $1,000s a month because she wanted to, not because she had to. So the portfolio needed about $5,000 a month or $60,000 a year, coming almost entirely from the brokerage account while the 401k sat untouched and kept compounding. By the time we modeled it out to 65, the math looked different than he expected. The brokerage draws were manageable. The retirement accounts had 6 more years of uninterrupted growth, and his Social Security, which he'd been assuming he'd take at 62, we actually pushed to 67 instead, which added about $800 a month to his benefit permanently. And the piece that surprised him most was the tax picture. Once his salary disappeared, his income dropped enough that we could start doing some chunks of 401k into Roths. And they were converted at rates he hadn't seen since he was in his 30s. So we were able to convert about $40,000 a year across those 6 years. By the time required minimum distributions came around in his 70s, his taxable IRA balance is going to be dramatically smaller than it would have been. See, that's real money he keeps instead of citing to the IRS. He sat across from me, he said, so retiring early actually makes me better off financially? In his case, yes, because the brokerage account handled the early years. The retirement accounts compounded undisturbed, and the tax window gave him something most working people never get access to. You see, when you retire early, your income drops significantly. And that gap, roughly say 55 to 70, it creates the best tax planning window of your entire financial life. Lower income means lower brackets, and lower brackets means you can convert traditional IRA money to a Roth at a fraction of what you had paid while you're in your peak earning years. You can manage how much of your Social Security gets taxed. You can shrink your future RMDs before they become a problem. David's situation is a good example of why this matters. While he was working, his income put him in the 32% tax bracket. Once he retired at 59, his taxable income had dropped dramatically. So it was low enough that we could do these conversions at 12%. And he did that for 6 years. And the tax savings on those alone ran well into the 6 figures compared to what he would have paid if he had converted at his working rate. Most people assume retiring early ends up with less money down the road. And with families who do this thoughtfully, it's usually the opposite. They capture a decade of tax planning that most working people never get access to. they end up wealthier in their 70s and 80s. And that's not an accident. It's just the math working in their favor for once. And there's one more thing that almost never gets factored into a lot of these calculations. A lot of these families, once they're no longer tied to an employer zip code, they move somewhere that actually makes financial sense for them. They have lower taxes, lower cost of living, they're closer to family. And that move alone, when it's the right one, can be worth real money every single year for the rest of your life. So healthcare is also an option. Healthcare is also obviously a concern. And it's typically the one sitting at the back of your mind. But it is a solvable problem. When your income drops in early retirement, ACA subsidies can make private insurance significantly more affordable than people expect. You've also got COBRA for roughly 18 months after you retire. And if you have health savings accounts, those provide tax-free medical spending if you've been building those up. For David, once we factored in ACA subsidies at his projected early retirement income, his insurance cost came in around $680,000 a month. It's not cheap, but it's not the deal breaker he'd assumed. See, healthcare is a line item and it goes in the budget. It gets planned for. It's not a reason to stay chained to your desk for another decade. When I talked to David and I showed him he could retire at age 59, he got quiet for a moment. So one thing I failed to mention is David actually has this daughter with special needs. His wife had been carrying most of that at home, right? So she had been doing all the work and she had been doing it on her own because David traveled for work. He traveled Monday through Thursdays and sometimes longer for years. He said, I've been away from my family all this time thinking I had no choice. Well, he did have a choice. He just needed someone to run the numbers and actually show him how to make it work. And now he can spend time with his daughter that he couldn't before. He could spend time with his wife that he didn't have before. And I think about him when people tell me they're planning on 65 because that's just what you do. His daughters, those years that he missed, those years can't be recovered. But now he has the opportunity to do it. And the families who do this well, they aren't rigid about it. The plan doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be able to flex. See, markets pull back. You swap that international trip for a domestic trip. It's not a failure. That's the plan working. Maybe you pick up a few hours a week doing extra work, something you actually enjoy, but not because you need to, because it has structure and the money doesn't hurt. See, these small adjustments are what allow the plan to stay strong when life doesn't cooperate. Unfortunately, life never really fully cooperates. So if you save real money, let's say you've saved $1 million or more, and 65 is just a number that you landed on because it was there, it might be worth sitting down and actually looking at it. Not a rule of thumb, say, but actually your numbers, your life, and what's actually possible. Like I said earlier, there's a link in the description where you can set up some time. I'd love to chat with you sometime and learn more about your situation. I really love making these videos. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you on the next one.